Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1993 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 2 of the podcast, we're talking with the featured composers from our 27th Other Minds Festival, which will take place November 14th to 19th, 2023, at the Taube Atrium Theater in Gray Area in San Francisco. Today, I'm joined by Morton Subotnick. Subotnick is an American composer who has worked extensively with interactive electronics and multimedia. He is a co-founder of the San Francisco Tape Music Center and one of the founding members of California Institute of the Arts. Subotnick is one of the pioneers in the development of electronic music and multimedia performance, and an innovator in works involving instruments and other media, including interactive computer music systems. Welcome to the podcast, Morton.
Thank you.
Since we're based in California here and you're a native son of California, I'd like to hear what was life like for you growing up in the Los Angeles area?
Good question. It was great. I hated it. I didn't know I hated it. I mean, I hated it, but I didn't know there was anything else. So I just didn't grow up very happy. My first more or less 8 years, 8 years were in Boyle Heights. It's now, I guess, coming up. I don't really know. But at the time, I was in a small section of Boyle Heights that was a Jewish ghetto. And I don't know how to tell you, but it was just full of problems. You know, they went to school and it was fine for the first 4 years. And then when I got into school, kids were being beaten up and there was just violence all over. We were having, this is in the 30s, we were having gang wars and parking lots, and there would be, you know, notices going up around that you could go if you went, the such and such a gang was going to be throwing things at another gang. They didn't have machine guns in those days, so that was a good sign. But it was a very, very rough neighborhood at that point in time when I was growing up. At a certain point, we went to New York. We drove to New York. I think we were still in Boyle Heights when that happened. We drove to New York to a family reunion in Long Island in New York. And I was flabbergasted in New York. It was so great. I mean, you walked on the street. You got a cup of coffee and talked to people. I didn't know you did that. I thought everything was with locked cars driving from one place to another. So I really loved that. That was great. And then at one point, when we went to New York, I auditioned. I was a clarinetist and kind of a virtuoso, I guess. And I auditioned for Juilliard when we went to New York, and he accepted me at Juilliard, and I told him we didn't have any money, so he gave me a scholarship. And this was an audition at the clarinetist's house. And when we got done, he was hovering over me. And by then I was like 15, 16 years old. I guess I wasn't in Boyle Heights anymore. And I felt him hovering over me, and I said, I won't mention his name, I said, do I owe you something? And he said, yes, my dear, my time is very valuable. $15 an hour. You've been here for 45 minutes. You owe me $7.50. And my dad had given me $10 in case of an emergency. So he gave me $2.50 back. And I drove out feeling like a midget. I felt so stupid that I didn't know you paid $15 an hour for an audition. And I get into the Lincoln Tunnel on the way back. He was in Philadelphia. And got into the Lincoln Tunnel, and the car stopped. in the middle of the Lincoln Tunnel. And then I had policemen yelling at me and honking and people yelling at me and honking. I felt like a disaster. And they towed me out. They had to close everybody off. And I don't know how they got me out, but they towed me out. And I called my father and they came and picked me up. And the car couldn't move. They put it in a garage and they had to work with it. So I was sitting in the back seat, and my cousin and my dad were driving the car. And all of a sudden, I thought, you'll see where this is going. It takes me actually to San Francisco. All of a sudden, I thought, I didn't know you had to pay, but if you did have to pay, I don't want any part of it. And if you didn't have to pay, I don't want any part of him. So I decided I wasn't going to go to Juilliard. And I felt much better. I had been offered a scholarship at USC. I thought I'll go to USC. So when I got out of high school, I graduated a year early and I got out young. And I had the scholarship where they gave me a room and board, tuition free, and paid me $100 a month to play in everything, the concert band, the football band, the orchestra. And also I had to play concerts on the road. I went out in the opera orchestra and I had to play concerts, chamber music concerts of clarinet and piano to recruit students for USC. So I didn't have time for students. I passed all music the first day and took graduate courses, which I loved, but I couldn't stay in them. And I was substituting for Mitchell Lurie, who was a great clarinetist in Los Angeles in the studios. And I substituted classical concerts and rehearsals when he couldn't make it. They would just call you out. So I knew the studio musicians very well, and I complained that I was going to school and I loved it, but I couldn't do anything because they kept taking me out to play. And they said, for $100 a month, they said, you should just go out and play in a symphony orchestra. And they said, this guy is here, the conductor of the Denver Symphony. We'll set up an audition time. And so I went and I got the job. So the next summer, I went to Denver. So I get to Denver, and when the orchestra started playing, I met a few people, and one of them was an artist, violist, and he was an artist, and his wife, she was a violinist. And he took me under his wing so that I could meet people. And we went to Central City, which is a ghost town outside of Denver, where they had these parties that went from Friday night to Monday morning that were all art parties and science and things when interesting people. I didn't realize that was the beginnings of the beat movement. And I had no idea. I mean, it wasn't called anything. So I never put it together until a few years ago. And they were great parties. And they had a piano there and you could bring music in and play. And so I wrote a piece for violin and viola and it got played. And this young pianist composer got up and played a piece of his. And a young filmmaker got up and showed his films. And that was Stan Brakhage, who became the leader of the counterculture of the avant-garde filmmaking, and the other composer was Jim Tenney, and we became the Three Musketeers, and we just hung out together. And at a certain point, I didn't need to go to school because I was playing, and I passed all music anyway. But there was a Korean War, so I was going to school, and after 2.5, or I think it was 2 years or 3 years, the draft decided I wasn't taking this seriously because I wasn't matriculating. I was taking courses in the early morning, in the afternoon. I had a full-time job. So I got drafted. And the Musicians Union in Los Angeles, which I still belong to that, gave people like any musician who was going to be drafted, you could stay an extra, I think, 6 months, and they would keep you from going to Korea. You could play in the Presidio in San Francisco, the band. And so that's how I got to San Francisco. And the rest is history.
And so you had this whole career going as a clarinetist. What sparked your shift over to electronics?
Okay, that's a good question. The war was over while I was still in the Army in San Francisco. So we're talking early 50s, 54, 55, something like that. And the job was you got up in the morning and they would have roll call or something like that. So I got an apartment off base and I began writing a lot of music, and I was playing at night and sleeping during the day in the Army. So I got known in the new music scene. At a certain point, I got a commission to do a score. I was known as, a young avant-garde composer at those times. So we're talking, the first studios were around 1955, and we're talking right around that time, about a year or so later. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed something. I got a fellowship to Mills College, went back to Denver, finished my degree, and then came back. But I came back because I had all this stuff. I mean, I was playing music and everything. And so around 1957 or 8, I got a commission to write a piece for a King Lear production by the Actors Workshop. They were it in those days. The groups were the Actors Workshop, Anna Halpern's dance company, when we got the Tape Center finally going, the Tape Center, and the Meme Troupe. I think they're still going, the San Francisco Meme Troupe. But those were 4 organizations going. They were really hot. They really had the place going. So the Actors Workshop offered me a commission to do a score for an avant-garde, real new concept of King Lear. And I thought, I don't want to write Mendelssohn's music I'm going to use this new music concrete thing, and bought my first tape recorder with the money from that, and took me a year to finish it. But it was considered, at the time, it was like, the whole production got these even though I didn't have quadraphonic, I did it with people moving the sound around, but with changing speakers and everything. It was just flying through the room, especially the storm scene. That was great. And the whole production got these rave reviews. It would later take the whole company to New York. That's how I got to New York later in 1960, about 10 years later, 7 years later. So that's how I started. And with the music concrete score, it was very hard work. I won't go into the details of what I did because it's going to take forever. I don't know if the score was good, but I've heard it in all those years. But it was very dramatic. And what I really loved about it more than anything else, this will get us back to how I got into this whole thing, was the fact that I could sit at home and be the composer, the conductor, the everything. And then I didn't have to go out in public. It would go in public, but I didn't have to go standing in front of people or sitting in front of people. And when the technology, which was just beginning at that point, not the technology of electronic music, but electronic music during that period was essentially an extension of post-Webern. Stockhausen and Boulez, Berriot, and all of these people were doing either an extension of post-Webern or creating the radio shows and things like that. But none of them saw this as the end of Webern. They didn't see it as a big shift. They saw it as an extension, maybe the last extension of fine art, symphonic music. And at a certain point around 1958, I began to realize that this was not the case, that what was going to happen was that because of the inexpensive quality of what the new technology was going to be, we were at the brink of a change that would be as fundamentally different for music as the printing press was for the language, that it would just be available to everyone. But I also realized that it was going to be digital. I was being a close friend of Jim Tenney. He was with Max Matthews and at AT&T, the early use of the computer. So I knew what they were doing at that point. And so what I realized, everything was going to be digital, but it would be at least 10 to 15, turned out to be close to 30 years later, that it would be available to everybody. But when it does become available, the language of digital music would be set on the computer by amateurs at best in music. And so young people like me who had been studying music and doing music and composing music from the time I was, I guess, about 6 years old, putting in 2 to 3 hours a day all those years, weren't going to move over to that to do anything. And that's exactly what happened. That, if it was an extension of fine art music, it would have been. But if it became just a popular thing that you could just press a button and it would play some music, or, whatever it was going to be, it wouldn't be interesting enough for people to do. So I decided to, even though I was just nobody, I guess nobody is nobody, but I was just a regular human being, I would start by trying to develop a way to create analog music using analog equipment. There were no synthesizers or anything at that point, but just objects, whatever I could to put together to try to form a way to create a new music, a new genre that wasn't dependent on traditional musical instruments at all. It wasn't based on traditional instruments. I have to insert something here. We found a flute that was 45,000 years ago in a place in Europe somewhere. And they determined that with the whole structure, it was a pentatonic flute. And a pentatonic scale is still today the most prominent scale for human beings. That's 45,000 years, and it had to be before then. And recently they found one 55,000 years ago, and in a cave that had only been touched by Neanderthals. So the Neanderthals had the flute 55,000 years ago when it was a pentatonic scale. So the change in music was great for us over the years, but it remained based on musical instruments. So you can play anything you want, but it's going to be tuned to some scale of some sort. So I thought with this new electronics, you wouldn't have to be there. It was going to be day one, 100,000 years ago, whatever it would be, and a new genre of a new kind of a new music would be there. But I knew it wasn't going to happen, but I felt obligated because nobody thought this, not even Ligeti, not even Stockhausen. They thought it was the new music, but not the new music, that wasn't relying. They were basing it on 12-tone post-Webern or music concrete for new radio. So I just wanted to make an example. And by 1961, I think it was, Ramón and I started the Tape Music Center, and Stan Brakhage was there then at that point. He actually made a film of us that's lost now. But I kept working at it and gave up finally. And in the second year, we moved to Divisadero Street. And the first thing I did was to put an ad in the paper to get an engineer to help me with this. And I won't go into the whole story, which is, again, very funny. But eventually, in fact, quite soon on, this fellow came in and he seemed to know what to do. And he said, I can do this for you, but it's not the right way to do it. We had come up with some cockamamie idea. And he came in and showed us what we had done, and electronically. He said, but this is not the way to do it, and explained control voltage and the whole thing with it. That would become, before MIDI, but it would become the basis of everything that happened after that. And so I said, sounds good to me. Let's go with it. And that was Don Buchla, and we began working on the Buchla 100. When I finally got it, I realized I was on really the right track, and that what I was doing may not be even, I mean, if I did it, it didn't mean anyone was going to follow me, because by then I knew Bob Moog and I knew where he was going. And we actually finished 1 year before he made his big system, but we were pretty much, side by side in that, so we knew each other. And I knew that what I was doing was the right thing to do. And I didn't think I was going to, in fact, I didn't change anything. That he's the one who changed everything because he did a black and white keyboard. But I wanted to fulfill my promise to myself that I would show what I knew and what I thought and work it out. And I realized that I knew so little about technology that it would be very easy for me to fall back on the clarinet. I could make a living anyway. I was getting commissions as a composer for instruments and well known for a young guy, but I didn't think I was that good a composer. I wasn't a Beethoven of the present day, so I figured they won't miss me either. But this is an idea that I should carry out that may be important. And if it's not, my obligation to myself is to go ahead and do it, not just to sit around and say, only if I had done that, this or that, and the next thing. So as soon as I could afford to give up the clarinet, because I had 2 kids at the time and a wife, and she was very ill, so I had horrible expenses. So I couldn't give up the clarinet until the company was invited to New York, and I was offered to be the director of the Vivian Beaumont. They were just building it, and the theater at Lincoln Center, and artist in residence. I didn't have to do anything, just be in NYU. So that would have given me a living more than I ever made in 1 year. And I could give up the clarinet, and that's when I gave it up and went.
You mentioned that part of the appeal of working in the studio in the earlier days was that you could be solitary and do your work and not have to interact with the other people, but you've been doing a lot of live performing recently. So when did you start doing live performances with electronics?
My first thought, good question. You're doing good questions. My first thoughts in San Francisco at the very beginning, when we first started working, when I started working with Don, I tried to conceptualize this sitting in my studio working, and I called it studio art. And the metaphor I used was the painter. You paint and you do all this stuff. And I figured the synthesizer was like, we didn't call it a synthesizer. I called it an analog computer for music. It was neutral. It wasn't a musical instrument. You made everything, including the musical instrument. And I thought of it with the metaphor of the painter, like the palette. You'd have a palette and a brush, and you would brush onto the screen. You'd mix the palette. That was what we were making the machine. And then you'd have to have input devices for the machine that would allow you to paint on the screen. It was a pretty good metaphor. And that's how I started with it. And the medium for witnessing it, getting the painting out, wasn't painting in public, but it was buying the thing and putting it in a museum or on someone's wall. And the equivalent to that, because this was the time of the beginning of long playing record, and the museum in the home was the record player. That's what was going to play it, because you don't send the thing out for someone to play, but you play it on a record. So the job is over in the studio, just like the painter's job, but the painter ends up with one painting on the wall that costs a lot of money. But in the case of this new music, it would be the player would be the phonograph player, and those records are cheap, an exact duplicate, so you don't end up with one, but you end up with as many as anyone wants, and the place it goes into the living room or played over the radio. So it seemed like the metaphor, just as I describe it, is pretty good. And so I went for a long time, and I never thought anything would be successful. But when Silver Apples came out, it was really successful. And I was invited out to play places, but I couldn't play. I'd have to bring tape recorders. And I thought, well, the way I can play it is to duplicate my studio. And so I would carry 300 pounds of stuff, literally. I had to have an assistant who would carry things out, and still it was not as good as what I could do in my studio. And so I kept waiting for the digital stuff to get better and better and better. And in the meantime, it did, but we didn't get the home computer. And even then it was just, it didn't do anything. The Macintosh was 450K, I think. It was, it just wasn't there. So I kept watching to see when I could reduce my equipment. And then in the meantime, many years later, 2009, I got a commission. I went to multimedia after that, which didn't require quite as much equipment because I had visual stuff and various kinds of stuff. And I went to the ghost pieces, which ended up, I don't know if you know those, but they're for performers, and performer gets modified in the auditorium. Those things could be done without my having to be there with tons of equipment. But I kept looking for this moment when I could play in public, and it had to be like my studio. So it wasn't until 2010, and right around that time, Buchla came up with his 200E, which is much smaller and it's partially digital. So that was small enough to be able to travel with. And when we were getting ready to do my opera in Austria, they wanted to attract young people. So they said, why don't you do a performance? I met Lillevan, who I've been working with now for years since then, with visuals. I wanted live projections in the opera. And why don't you and Lillevan go off and do some performances to attract in Austria, to attract young people to your opera? And so I said, okay, well, we'll take the 200E. And in the meantime, I took the 200E from Buchla, but in the meantime, I wasn't really interested in it because I was so tired of carrying equipment around. I was using kind of haphazard digital way to do music. It wasn't very good, but I could do. It was a multimedia kind of thing, so I did it. And the audience, the first performance we did was at a. This is around 2009, 2010. We did a performance at a art museum. And they kept applauding. And I brought the 200E with me with the lights going. I patched it, but I didn't play on it. I just did my old stuff. And it was okay, but they loved it. And they kept applauding. And we kept standing up. And I asked Lillevan, I said, well, what do they want from us? And he whispered in my ear, they want an encore. I said, an encore? What the hell is an encore? I can't do an encore. I could barely do what I did. And I looked and the Buchla was flashing and I thought, okay, let's do an encore. And I decided just to play I knew the Buchla so fucking well that, excuse the word, but I just knew I could do it. So I said, okay, let's do it. So we played and boy, was I happy. It was so much fun playing, and we did 2 encores. And finally I told the people that, thank you very much, but we can't do it. And I was really happy with it. And so I began doing it with the 200E. And so we started doing concerts at that point. And I could do something like what I was doing before. In the meantime, computers got better and better. And as late as the middle of I guess just the beginning of the pandemic, computers became so good with the new speed and the memory and everything. And then SoftTube came out with Buchla oscillator. I helped them test it to make sure it was the same as the analog version of it. And it was exactly the same. And a couple of other modules that they did. And Ableton, I was using Ableton by then because I had used it in the opera. And Ableton design is the most open design of anything I've seen. It's really wide open. And we reached the point where I could, with my new computer, and then MIDI came out, of course, years before, but it also allowed for people like, I forgot his name now from Ableton, but he was able to use MIDI integrated into a much more open structure. And to make a long story short, no, because I made it quite long, I'm now able to go off without the 200E. I have, in Live and Breathe, I have roughly, I think, 40 oscillators. you just you just download one and copy and paste, and you've got 40. And there's no equipment. It doesn't cost a penny to carry or anything. And when Ableton moved to Max Live, you can do your own programming or get interesting programming. And I have duplicated all the functions of the Buchla and more without any modules. What I wanted to do way back, in 1967, what I dreamed of doing. And I've got it all on my computer, and I've got these little interfaces, Korg interfaces, which they were $40 each. I'm looking at them. I've got 4 of those and one launcher, and that's it. And my computer, and I can put my voice in it, because in 1968 I had Don built what may have been the first envelope follower, so I could use my voice, not just my fingers as pressure, but my voice. And I still use my voice as either my voice, or say I'll make a sound that goes whoa, and I put that into the envelope follower. So when I make a sound and it reaches its zenith, it places it somewhere in the room. I mean, it's wonderful. It's exotic. It's things I could never do before, and it doesn't have to be fixed. If I play something, I can record it and make a sample of it, and then play it and change it. I mean, it's so much fun. And so As I Live and Breathe is my last piece, because it's taken me to the one place I couldn't go. And I just feel at 90, I feel blessed that I've reached the point where finally, from 1961 to when I was not even 30 yet, but it's a long time, and I feel really blessed that I'm able to do it. It's been developing. The version I do in San Francisco is going to be, I'm touring with it. I started in I've already done performances of it, but for almost 2 years now. But it's been changing, and it's going to be the latest version I will do. I'll start in the Venice Biennale, kicking that off in October, and end up in San Francisco.
We'll also be screening a documentary about your life and work called Subotnick, Portrait of an Electronic Music Pioneer, on November 14th at Gray Area. Did you enjoy the process of being part of making that documentary?
Yeah, I took it as part of, I have to add something. When I was 8 years old, I found a couple of books in the garage my parents had put there that hadn't been touched. And I, for some reason, took a book by Epictetus and Aurelius. Well, anyway, it was 2 books on Stoic philosophy from the Greeks. I don't know what the fuck I did that for, but I did it. And somehow I came away from that as understanding that I understood that Stoic philosophy is a little like existentialism. And for an 8-year-old kid who didn't know anything about any of that, it was existential. And it gave me the sense that you create who you are, and you follow principles of the person you've created. So the example was that Epictetus had a beard. This lingered in my mind, but for some reason it was not very high-tutin philosophy. But he said, I chose to be a philosopher, and my beard is my symbol. And if you said, we're going to kill you if you don't shave your beard off, he said, I would choose to be killed because I am who I am, which is Popeye, but but profound still. And that was very profound to me. So I decided what that meant is that you decide what you can do. The meaning of life is something you invent. And so what I invented was the meaning of being a human being is to find out what you can do it the very best you can and continue doing it the very best you can and offer it to other people and share it. That stuck with me to this day. For some reason, it just meant a whole lot. It still does. I don't know if that's what he meant, but it's what my life has been. Yeah, so the documentary is part of that. It's part of sharing. So their documentary is not finished because I refused for it to be finished and because I'm still alive and there's still things. It's not an autobiography other than what I just did. I'm not giving you the secrets of my life. I'm sharing with you and your audience my invented life that I'm sharing, the work with music. And the documentary is that. So I've been correcting it. And they had to refilm. One of them is coming to film me in Venice so he can get that part of it in, and it'll be a PS at the end. I say at the end, I guess this is it. I'm retiring now. I've done all I can. And then all this happened, right? I started the documentary before, so I said, we can't stop there. So he's going to do a version that he's cutting that won't be shown in San Francisco because he has to do it after all these concerts. So the documentary I'm really happy with because it is exactly what I said. I was picked up, as you know, by the younger generation from electronics. And what I do isn't anything like what they do, but they recognize that, and it's getting closer and closer to their really understanding what I do. And the questions I'm getting from audiences and things are much closer to what I was doing. And it shows that experience of the coming out and doing things. I'm using portable buchla in most of those because the early filming was in places where I was bringing the 200E, which I could do something meaningful with. So yeah, I'm pleased with what they've been doing with it. They're doing a really nice job.
You can hear Morton Subotnick's As I Live and Breathe, performed by the composer with Berlin-based video artist Lillevan at Other Minds Festival 27 on November 16th at the Taub Atrium Theater in San Francisco. You can also see a screening of the documentary Subotnick, Portrait of an Electronic Music Pioneer on November 14th, 2023 at Gray Area. Thank you, Morton, for talking with me today, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 27th festival is November 14th to 19th, 2023 at the Taub Atrium Theater in Gray Area in San Francisco.